Good evening. I want to welcome you to this study on the Atonement, and I want to thank you for joining us. I don't normally say this in the introduction, but I really do appreciate whoever is watching this. My intent is to do what I can to expose people to substantive, theological, solid, biblical truth from a Reformed perspective. That's definitely a minority report today, and I think that we need not only a revival, but a reformation. So I would really appreciate it if you would pass this along to your friends. It's a free way to go to seminary to the extent that I think I can teach you some solid doctrine. So let's learn together. We're still in the middle of a long series on a controversial subject, and that's what some people call limited atonement, but what I prefer to call definite atonement or particular redemption. And the fact that it's simply part of the atonement means that it's very important. I don't care whether it's controversial. If it's part of the cross, then it's important. And if I'm right, if the Reformed perspective on this is right, then that means that 90% of the church has got the gospel upside down. And that's not good. And so, by God's grace, pray that He'll use my small little stumbling efforts to help. So, the title of this is Church History in Definite Atonement, Part 5. We're going to look at this from all different perspectives, and I decided to have at least one segment dealing with the issue of church history as it relates to the doctrine of definite atonement, doing a little bit of historical theology. And so let's dig in. Though Scripture is definitive in this debate regarding definite atonement, it is wise and I think interesting and fun to examine what we can learn from church history. If the book of Acts has 28 chapters, and it does, then we are currently in the 29th chapter. That's the way I like to look at it. Our church today, that we are in an extension, the church today is an extension of the book of Acts. More significantly, the promises of Christ to His church throughout the ages holds true. He would be with us, He would be conquering through us, and advancing His kingdom, and that the gates of hell would not prevail against His church, His bride. So it's proper to spend at least one segment asking, what has the church down through the ages believed regarding that question? For whom did Christ die? Was it each and every person or for His bride? Also, we are creatures of our time. We just have to be honest about that. And we need a historical perspective to know that we sometimes take things for granted as being gospel that may not be the pure gospel. We need to avoid the chronological fallacy, and that is thinking that a practice or a belief is true depending on how old or how new it is. Sometimes the old paths are the best and the most biblical, especially in our crazy times. So it's my intent to do a whirlwind tour of church history, so fasten your seatbelts, all right? In the 1700s, a brilliant man named John Gills, wrote a book entitled The Cause of God and Truth. And in this book, he collected, and in doing so, he translated many of the patristic fathers, the guys who lived right after the apostles, many of those texts. And he did this in order to counter the arguments of this was in the 1700s. An Arminian writer had just written a book that had become very popular, and it was written to undermine the doctrines of grace. So this brilliant brother, John Gills, wrote this book, The Cause of God and Truth, to counteract that. And so he looked at it's a daunting task too, looking at the patristics. And he noted that in his translations that many of them implicitly, if not explicitly, refer to definite atonement. Now, due to being preoccupied with other serious controversies, the patristic fathers, we're talking about like the year 100 to 200, 250. Due to being preoccupied with other serious controversies like that surrounded the Trinity and the person of Christ, the idea of the extent of the atonement, it wasn't an issue, it wasn't an emphasis, it wasn't even being discussed. We tend to zero in on the things that are being controverted, debated, and even with Augustine and the Pelagian conflict in the early 5th century, the extent of the atonement was not at the heart of the debate. However, he did discuss it, and he did believe in definite atonement. But we can glean information which reveals that there's what I call a trajectory of thought with the patristics that expressed a particular and a definite nature of God's salvation and atonement. There are significant traces of this truth found in the earliest of the patristic fathers. For example, the earliest, Clement of Rome, whom I understand was born somewhere around 35 and died somewhere around 100, and as I understand it, knew both Paul and Peter. In May is again, I'm not sure of all, I am not a patristics expert by any means, okay? But there is a Clement that is mentioned in one of the books, so I'm not sure if that's him or not, but he was definitely around. But he, in what is perhaps the earliest communication that we have after the close of the canon, is a document called the Epistle to the Corinthians from Clement of Rome. And as I said, it's earliest communication we have after the canonical writings. And he seems to affirm definite atonement in this document as he equates the dying of Christ for his elect. Okay? As he seems to equate or affirm definite atonement as he equates the dying of Christ for his elect. And that may be a possible reference to that. And he does refer to the elect often. I looked at his epistle to the Corinthians just briefly before I started this, and I can see the word elect sprinkled here and there. Moving to Justin Martyr, who was at his peak between 190 and 220. He was a North African theologian and philosopher. And again, though not explicit, Justin Martyr, the way that he links Christ's death to definite atonement is by the means of considering Christ's cross a penal substitution. We may take that for granted today. Well, no, I take that back. That is the heart of the cross, penal substitution, and it's being attacked left and right. But I think, to me, penal substitution is one of the strongest arguments for definite atonement. When you take into consideration all that is included in penal substitution, I see no way that could be applied to a potential atonement. It has to be real. It has to be an actual atonement. And he also deals and talks about the elect and the atonement as well. This is kind of the backdrops for the Reformation that takes place, in the 1500s. All right, there's a guy named Ambrose who died in 388, and one of the things that Ambrose did was that he was the first to use what is known as a double jeopardy argument, which John Owen, who wrote the book The Death of Death and the Death of Christ, which is the definitive defense of definite atonement, written in 1648, somewhere around there. He uses that double jeopardy argument in defense of definite atonement, because what that talks about is basically double jeopardy is how could a person whose sins have been paid for by Christ then pay for them in hell as well. That's double jeopardy. And with the universal atonement view, that's precisely what you would have, a double jeopardy. So that's why he is part of that trajectory, because he brought that issue up. Then we come to Jerome, Jerome, who lived in the 400s around the same time as Augustine, and he's best known for his translation of the Bible into Latin, which became known as the Latin Vulgate, and it was standard reading. We think that the King James Bible's been around a long time, but the Latin Vulgate was around for a lot longer than the King James has. Anyway, Jerome made some comments that indicated that Christ died for a particular group of people, believers. Christ died for a particular group of people, believers. I know that may not be much, but again, it's part of the trajectory. And as we go along, you'll see it's going to get more and more specific and more detailed. Then we come to Augustine. We're talking about the 5th century, 400s. He's perhaps best known for his debate with a guy named Pelagius, who was a British monk. And Pelagius basically denied everything. He denied original sin, and he affirmed that human nature is basically good, and that we're able to follow God's commands without the help of grace. While Augustine insisted upon the need for God's grace at every stage, especially in salvation. Now, you have to understand, Augustine is held by many people, especially in Reform circles, as being the greatest theologian in the history of the church ever, certainly in the first 1,000 years. And those of us, again, who hold to Reformed doctrine, instead of, sometimes people call Calvinists, but equally called Augustinians, because he's the one who really picked up on Pauline doctrine, Jesus doctrine, grace, and grace alone. Because Arminianism believes in grace, it just doesn't believe in grace alone. So, after studying Romans, Augustine came to the conclusion that we cannot make any step towards salvation. None. So there you got the notion of effectual or irresistible grace there. And he stressed very strongly the bondage of the will. And just to say in advance, it's no wonder that Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, his favorite book that he wrote was The Bondage of the Will. So anyway, Augustine saw salvation, the process, as being monergistic. That is, the first stages of salvation are monergistic. And this monergistic view of salvation entailed definite redemption. And there are numerous passages in his corpus, his body of writing, in which Augustine reflects this view explicitly of definite atonement. In commenting on John 26 regarding the sheep, Augustine said that Jesus' opponents had been predestined to damnation, and the blood of Christ was not shed for them. Okay. And it's also seen in his comments on 1 John 2:2, which is kind of ironic because that's often used as against definite atonement. He says that the phrase "the whole world" is not all without exception, but rather church of all nations, all without distinction. He may have been the first one to come up with that, and it's a very important one. The all or whole world can refer to all without exception or all without distinction. And so, for time's sake, let me move on. His younger contemporary, who really looked up to him, was a guy named Prosper, and he was a disciple of Augustine's. This is what Prosper said, quote, "Christ was crucified only for those who were to profit from his death." Christ was crucified only for those who were to profit from his death. All right, do you see these? And this is the elect he's talking about. So he was even more vocal than Augustine, at least at first. So though these folks did not have a full-orbed view of definite atonement, they demonstrated a defined and particular purpose of God in salvation. They made distinctions of how all can refer to all without distinction versus all without exception. They showed different definitions of the word world. There's 10 different definitions of world in just the Gospel of John. For talk about the double jeopardy argument, they use particularistic language regarding Jesus' death and its connection to election. If you have election, it's hard to avoid what follows from it as far as a particular atonement. And so all of them, each of them, collectively and individually, laid the groundwork for later and more mature presentations of the doctrine of definite atonement in the history of the church, especially in the late 16th centuries and the 17th centuries. And I'm glad I'm doing this because a lot of people had a mistaken notion that definite atonement was a invention of Calvin and Beza and John Owen, and nothing could be further from the truth. So, let's move on. It's often assumed, like I said, that it was not until the 16th and 17th centuries that definite atonement had any clear support. But, as I said, it's not accurate. A guy named Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, I'm sure you heard of him, both wrote about predestination. They both wrote about free will and its bondage, and they both wrote about definite atonement. Okay, there was a continuity. Now we jumped a few centuries. There was a continuity between Augustine and the early medieval monks. As I said, Luther was an Augustinian monk. But before I get into Lombard and Aquinas, let me talk about just a few other people. There was a continuity between Augustine and early medieval monks. In the 6th century, there was a fellow named Fulgentius who made comments about definite atonement. Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century made comments about definite atonement. Isidore of Seville made comments about definite atonement in the early 7th century. They made comments which were consistent with definite atonement and became part of the theological tapestry. Now we come to the 8th century. During the Carolingian period, which was the mid-8th to the late 10th centuries, questions of predestination and definite atonement were on the forefront. They were on the front burner and were debated in heated exchanges. It was especially clear in the teaching of a guy named Gottschalk in the 9th century. Let's talk about him. Gottschalk. Just spelled like it sounds. Gottschalk. 808 through 867. In his publishing and his preaching, along with his contemporaries, Ratramus, Florus, Prudentius, and Servetus. I'm letting you know these people's names, not so you remember them, just so that you see the flow, and that there was a remnant, if you were, when it comes to solid doctrine throughout church history. They were all strict Augustinians and argue that Christ died for the elect. And getting back again to a guy who's becoming a hero of mine, Gottschalk, he was the main spokesman, and he argued along the lines of Augustine that human will is in bondage, as it is, and it needs divine grace to choose righteousness. He went a little further than Augustine in the fact that he affirmed double predestination. But if you believe in predestination at all, you have to believe in double predestination, not equal ultimacy, but there has to be a double aspect to it. If the state of the one is clear, then that implies the state of the other is clear as well. Anyway, he states in his shorter catechism this teaching about double predestination. And he talks about the fate of Satan, whom he saw as the head over all demons or fallen angels. And I bring that out because in my involvement with helping people who are overly fascinated in the paranormal and thus have gotten into trouble with the demonic, there's a lot of really stupid, foolish ideas out there about the identity of our enemy. And it's really simple. There's Satan, and then there's his co-fallen angels or demons. And it's as simple as that. Anyway, Gottschalk appealed to Ephesians 1:11. It was key to him, the divine decree. Regarding definite atonement, he's very definite. In a letter to Rabanus Maurus, he said this: God, the creator and maker of all creatures, has designed to be gratuitous, has designed to be the gratuitous repairer and restorer of all the elect alone, but willed to be the Savior of none, of the perpetually reprobate, the Redeemer of none, and glorifier of none. Okay. God, the creator and maker of all creatures, is designed to be the gratuitous repairer. That means the gracious, basically the gracious redeemer of all the elect alone. But he also willed to not save any of the reprobate. Put it in Hunnemann's words. In his book on predestination, Gottschalk says, quote, "We, of course, correctly believe, rightly hope, and trust that the body and blood of Christ were handed over and shed for the church of Christ alone." It's definitely definite atonement. So he was not alone in his convictions, and that was rooted in Augustinian theology, but mainly Scripture. Okay, from Genesis to Revelation. And it's my real contention that we have a jellyfish Christianity today, evangelicalism, but we need one with a backbone to face the postmodernism, moral relativism that we're in. And by God's grace, may there be a reformation. In 849, he was condemned, Gottschalk was, in a mock council, but 6 years later, in 855, at the Council of Valence, he was vindicated. Yay! All right, then the Viking invasions began, and it quieted theological debate. Kind of has that effect, doesn't it? For a while. But a short time later, and fast forwarding a little bit, things calmed down. And formal education, as you know it, the university started in earnest. Places like Oxford and whatnot got started, and the acrimony and the yelling and shouting over predestination and definite atonement calmed down a little bit. They are still being discussed. They just weren't hitting each other. Okay. Instead, definite atonement was presented. Listen to this. Definite atonement was presented to theological students as the dominant view. Okay? Now, 90%, if not more, I don't know, believe in a universal atonement. But back in the 800s and 900s, and then along comes, let's see, this would have been 1,000 or so. Anyway, definite atonement was presented to theological students as a dominant view. Now, here he comes along a guy named Peter Lombard, and his magisterial work, the 4 books of sentences. And he lived from 1100 to 1160. I'm giving you those dates so you can just kind of have an address for where we are as far as church history and the flow of church history. You need try to remember that, because that book, the 4 books of sentences, or sentences for short, was used for centuries. Centuries. Hundreds of years. It was the standard systematic theology for all seminary students. So anyway, he was a theologian at Notre Dame in Paris, and his sentences was, as I said, a systematic theology read by all for a long, long time, and had a massive influence on the theological development during the Middle Ages and beyond. So, and Peter Lombard was the originator of the phrase "sufficient for all and efficient for some. In his book on the incarnation of the Word, Peter says, quote, Christ offered himself on the altar of the cross, not to the devil. I'm going to stop there for a second. There was, in the Middle Ages, it was commonplace notion that the ransom theory of the atonement was that a payment was due and was paid to the devil on the cross. And that may sound ridiculous to us, but it really was very, very popular. I think it originated with Origen, and you can imagine with the people in the villages how common it would be. I was taught it as a kid at parochial school, and anyway, he's saying that that's not true. On the altar of the cross, I like that language. Not to the devil, but the ransom was paid to the triune God, his phrase, to the triune God. And he did so for all with respect to the sufficiency of the price. He did so for all with respect to the sufficiency of the price. Okay? It's sufficient for all. The cross is sufficient to pay for all. But only for the elect regards to its efficacy, because he brought about salvation only for the predestined. End quote. Wow, that's rich. As with Augustine, he says that Christ died only for the elect. The extent of the atonement is definite. But we would affirm with him that it's sufficient to pay for 10 million worlds of people if they existed. But it's efficient just for God's elect, which is very humbling. It really is. In an interesting twist, he couches his discussion of election in terms of the Trinity and of his wisdom. And his quoting in the Bible is voluminous. He stresses that God predestines all the blessings along with the predestination based on God's decree and his wisdom. So regarding foreknowledge and free will, what does he have to say? Well, does God merely predestine those he knows in advance will respond properly, as our Arminians friends say? No. He does something different by grounding foreknowledge in God's wisdom. See, back then, they always started with God in their systematic theologies. It's still pretty common to do that, but he stated that foreknowledge is not just mere awareness of facts regarding the future. This is not wisdom based merely on observation, but it's wisdom in the very being of God himself. His knowledge is the cause of future events, not vice versa. He causes all things to pass without being the author of evil. When it comes to salvation, his foreknowledge of wisdom is causative. Okay, we're still talking about Lombard, by the way. His foreknowledge of wisdom is causative. Left to ourselves, we would never be saved. Christ died for his elect. God is central to Lombard's thinking, and not just God, but he speaks of God in God's simplicity. And what that, guys, is theological reasoning. What God predestined before the foundation of the world will most certainly come to pass. Now, the simplicity of God means that God is all that he is in every way and at all times. The simplicity of God means that God is not complex, okay? He doesn't have an arm and a leg and all that sort of thing. I'll just say the way he is. The simplicity of God means that God is all that he is in every way and at all times. Okay? He has attributes that we can distinguish, like his holiness, his mercy, and his justice, but he's all those at the same time and in all places. So among fallen humanity, God has purposed that some be saved while others are left to themselves in reprobation. Christ died for the elect whom God had predestined to salvation. Okay. Now Lombard is keen to make sure that we remember that we can never earn or expect grace. Now, if you or a friend ever find yourself complaining about predestination, that it's not fair because that God chose you and not someone else, then complaining that God does not save someone else is an expression of a profound misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the graciousness of grace. Okay. He grounds, again Lombard, definite atonement in God's wisdom as well as his grace. And he ends up in Romans 11, like Paul does, in doxology. So the evangelical community of today needs to realize that in the medieval church, there's a lot more we can learn from than we usually think. It is true, in my mind, that there was what I call an anti-millennium, in which, because of the sacramentalism, the gospel itself got so cocooned, there was a darkness. And the phrase for the Reformation was post tenebras lux, after the darkness light. But there was still a lot of bright spots in teaching about specific doctrines like definite atonement. So again, the evangelical community needs to learn from the medieval church about definite atonement, because during that time, definite atonement was not a minority view. Lombard's sentences was adopted and used as required reading for centuries for theology students. So the later reformers, Luther and Calvin, did not create something new, okay? But there was a continuity with the past, going all the way back to Clement. No, going all the way back to Jesus. Going all the way back before the foundation of the world, because that's when the design was. Since it was standard reading for centuries, this book helped to create the basis for later, more refined notions in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Peter Lombard bridged the gap with the Reformation. Luther and Calvin would have studied him in seminary. Let's jump to Thomas Aquinas real quick, the Doctor Angelicus of the Roman Catholic Church. Brilliant man. 1225 through 1274, so the next century after Lombard. We see evidence of Peter's influence in the next century, and especially in Aquinas. In reading Thomas Aquinas, it is apparent that he was influenced by Aristotle, but also by Peter Lombard and his magnum opus, the Sentences. While not as explicit as Peter Lombard, Aquinas, while not as explicit as Peter regarding definite atonement, Aquinas' theology does point in that direction clearly. He does say that Christ's blood was shed for the elect alone. Christ's blood was shed for the elect alone. That's pretty definite, pretty daggone clear. And Aquinas states early in his book his belief in predestination, because again, their practice is rooted in the doctrine of God which is dealt with first. But anyway, he strongly believes that as Aquinas does in predestination or election, and this then would lead logically and biblically to Christ dying only for his elect. So, I guess we'll stop as quickly as we started. These men that I quoted were just some of the people that God raised up to teach His church. Just a few of the people in the last 20 to 2,000 years or so, and they were watering seeds that were planted before the lights came on in the Reformation. We should be very grateful for it. I mentioned before that the theme for the Reformation is post tenebras lux, after the darkness light. And these men that I quoted from Clement onwards to Peter Lombard and so on, Gottschalk, they were all watering seeds, and they were each one was an important link in the chain that led to Martin Luther's "Here I Stand" moment, which he stood single-minded and by himself against the church and the civil authorities for the gospel. So we need to see that definite atonement is definitely not a novel idea. Soli Deo Gloria. Thank you for your time. By the way, if you like it, like it. Thanks.